This is our fourth, and I cannot really believe that it's actually our fourth town hall of 2021, AAPI Women, Power, and the ERA. We're delighted that you're here tonight. We have a couple of house notes. One, we are being recorded. ASL interpreters are available throughout the program, and closed captioning available on your Zoom at the bottom of your screen. Our series of events for 2021 and 2022 is supported by the Harnisch Foundation and Ruth Ann Harnisch. Thank you so much for these 2 years of great conversations. I'm Carol Jenkins, President and CEO of the ERA Coalition and the Fund for Women's Equality, sister organizations working on the 28th Amendment, and that's the Equal Rights Amendment. We have almost 200 partner and supporting organizations across the country, representing millions of people who believe in equality and believe our Constitution can be amended to provide an equal future for everyone. Our conversation will be led tonight by Dr. Julie Suk, sociology and political science professor at the CUNY Graduate Center and a visiting professor and senior researcher at the Yale Law School. She serves on the ERA Coalition's Legal Task Force and our Advisory Council. She is the author of We the Women, the Unstoppable Mothers of the Equal Rights Amendment, as well as many scholarly evaluations of the amendment and its long and very complicated odyssey. Julie, thanks so much for leading the conversation tonight and for being here.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be facilitating this very important conversation this evening. It's my great honor to be introducing our wonderful panelists. Tonight we'll be joined by Miho Kim. She is a member of the executive committee and a co-founder of the Comfort Women Justice Coalition. She's also a co-founder of Eclipse Rising, the first Zainichi Korean social justice organization in the United States. Then we'll hear from Yolanda Zhang, also a panelist, organizer of Ain't I a Woman campaign, Youth Against Sweatshops, and at the Flushing Workers Center. We're also delighted to be joined by Reshma Sojani this evening. She is the founder of Girls Who Code and also the Marshall Plan for Moms. Finally, we also have Kumu Hina with us this evening. Kumu Hina is a cultural practitioner and community leader in Hawaii. And before I hand it off to the panelists, I just want to say a few words about the importance of Asian American women and power and the ERA, the topic of this evening's town hall. In my research about the long and winding history of the women's struggle in the United States for an equality amendment in the US Constitution, one figure who was so important but often overlooked is Patsy Mink. Patsy Takemoto Mink was a Japanese American woman from Hawaii and the first woman of color to be elected to Congress in 1964. She was a fierce advocate for the ERA in the floor debates in Congress, also testified in Congress in 1970 and 71 about the Equal Rights Amendment, supporting it. And what was really amazing about Patsy Mink's work on the ERA was that it was not a one-off with regard to gender justice. She was simultaneously working on other very important pieces of legislation, including Title IX. She is known as the mother of Title IX, and in fact, in 2002, Title IX of the Educational Opportunity Act was actually named after Patsy Mink because of the leading role that she played in getting it passed. Another very important signature piece of legislation that she worked on as a congresswoman was the Comprehensive Child Development Act, so relevant today as we think about the need for childcare policy at the national level. In the early 1970s, she held hearings on the Comprehensive Child Development Act because she understood and often asserted that working women, and particularly mothers, would never really have a chance to fulfill the promise of equal opportunity unless they had a place, a safe place to leave their children. And so she worked to build bipartisan coalitions along with Shirley Chisholm, the first African-American woman elected to Congress, Although they were able to get childcare legislation passed through both houses of Congress with bipartisan support, it was vetoed by the president in 1971. And we are still working today, 50 years later, to get childcare legislation and childcare as an established part of the national infrastructure. When she advocated for the Equal Rights Amendment, Patsy Mink also brought a unique perspective as a woman lawyer who had been educated at the University of Chicago Law School, as one of the very few women who attended law school at all, let alone an Asian American woman. And as a lawyer, she understood that courts were not going to deliver the gender justice entirely needed. That is, she understood that when the ERA became part of the Constitution, what was equally important to the guarantee of equal rights was not simply the possibility of going to court to enforce your rights, but also the empowerment that it would deliver to American women who were citizens and voters, as well as American women who were legislators. Specifically, it would not just be the words in the Constitution, but the possibility of our legislators writing laws like Title IX and like the Child Care Act to make equality real for women throughout the country. And then today, 50 years later, 50 years after much of the groundwork and intellectual architecture that she gave to the Equal Rights Amendment with many of her female colleagues in Congress sponsoring the ERA in the early 1970s. Today, 50 years later, there are many issues we are still dealing with. I think just in the past month and a half, particularly after the shootings of several Asian American women in Atlanta, I think there's been renewed public attention to Asian Americans and the issue of violence and violence against women and gendered violence in particular. The gendered violence against Asian American women is closely connected to a long history of stereotypes about Asian American women, the hypersexualization of Asian American women, and that hypersexualization is connected historically, not only to Asian women's experiences in the United States, but also American wars in Vietnam and Korea that have spanned the 20th century. And as we talk about the ERA, one of the central issues that have come up as to why a constitutional amendment is needed is to authorize Congress and authorize all levels of government to do more and as much as possible to combat violence against women and to remedy it appropriately. And then finally, much of our conversation in 2021, again, 50 years after Patsy Mink was talking about the struggles of working women and childcare. Today, the pandemic has made clear that women are over-concentrated in essential and underpaid work. Being in essential and underpaid work, especially in the service industry, makes people, particularly women, more vulnerable to harassment and violence. And so there are policy solutions that go beyond non-discrimination, a living wage, childcare policy, infrastructure that we need to start thinking about way beyond simply prohibiting discrimination and violence. And the Equal Rights Amendment is an important constitutional foundation for that policy infrastructure. So with that in mind, I would love for the panelists to tell us about the work they do and the importance at this moment of connecting their agendas to these more foundational legal claims that I think the ERA will facilitate. So why don't we start with Miho? Thank you so much, Miho, for joining us.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you so much for having me, and greetings to everyone. My name is Miho Kim, and I'm based in San Francisco Bay Area. Many of you may be familiar through the news that 2 years ago, a Comfort Woman Memorial was erected on public land in San Francisco. That was the work of the coalition, Comfort Women Justice Coalition, the organization that I belong to. And we campaigned for over 2 years to get the memorial erected. And I want to talk about that particular issue and how it might connect to rights of women. I do only have 3 minutes, and I want to make sure that I get to introduce this issue for any of you who might not be familiar. And I know that there's discussion time reserved after the panel. So I look forward to a conversation then. So to start, comfort women. This is a euphemism for an estimated upwards of 500,000 sexually enslaved girls and women taken by the Japanese military from nations colonized and occupied by Imperial Japan until their defeat in World War II. They suffered atrocious violence in a massive, in fact, one of the largest known institutionalized form known, but massive institutionalized and coordinated sex trafficking and forced sexual labor system that imprisoned them and where they were subject to frequent sexual violence and abuse. 90% of these women are said to have perished in captivity. Most of these victims were Korean and Chinese, and where Japan had fully placed, under its colonial rule. But there are also victims who are Dutch, even American nurses, Australians, aside from local women and girls. In 1991, Korean survivor Kim Hak-sun, a grandmother, came out for the first time publicly saying that she was a comfort woman. That's how the world came to know that there was such a system that existed in the first place. But this opened space for other women enslaved across all the other territories. And it really led to the movement that we're in midst of right now, and also a fight to preserve their voices and histories so that the history will never be repeated. And that's the context in which we organized in San Francisco to have this memorial erected. By this time, I just want to mention another piece of context. The Japanese government had officially adopted a position that comfort women system was an entirely fabricated story, and that Japan needed to budget $500 million per year as part of global diplomacy to correct the history of Japan. We're seeing a lot of this, effort through Japan's soft power. But anyway, we, were very alarmed because denialism, historical denialism, what that does is it'll erase the grandmother's voices. And this is something we have observed in other cases as well, is that women, because their voices can be questioned more easily, that, is a go-to tactic to discredit the women. My time is up. And so we have, had to really rally around. And I don't think that this movement would have really been able to take off had it not been for the global feminist movement. Kim Hak-sun Harmony, the grandmother, would not have been able to have that platform. And we know firsthand as women, there's stigmatization involved, and that we need the movement to be able to speak up and break the silence and to sustain our efforts for change. So that's the lesson. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Miho. Yolanda.
Thank you. And thank you, Miho, for a powerful introduction to the campaign. And so I'll briefly take my time to introduce the Ain't I a Woman campaign, which is definitely related to the fight of immigrant women in general as well. Our campaign is led by workers. We like to claim ourselves not as an advocacy organization, not as a service or effort, community service effort, even though we do distribute PPE throughout the pandemic at Flushing Worker Center and beyond. We see ourselves as the community. And who is this community but working people? And I want to emphasize who are leading our campaign. From our experience, women workers, immigrants, especially the hardest hit, the ones that the society sees as the powerless and the weak, they are the closest to fire, but also they have no illusions about the system. In the United Women campaign, women who started this campaign organized together with their male co-workers to fight for their old wages, the stolen wages, and sometimes definitely sexual discrimination as well. Those women went on to demand the control of their time because they saw how getting paid properly was not enough when the crushing hours and that they had to work in factories and garment factories back then, and now home care are killing them, destroying their health and their families, denying them any kind of life, right? They they don't make memories with their grandchildren, et cetera, et cetera. So for the Justice for Home Care Workers program under the campaign, Chinese home attendant workers came out in 2015 and said that they've had enough. They did this class action among many class actions from the home attendants community throughout New York State, demanding 16 million of stolen wages from the period of 2009 to 2014 alone. And this campaign later grew to involve the bulk of the working people related to home attendants. First, it grew to include consumer justice, grew to get patients and people receiving the care involved, because they are also poor and low-income Medicaid eligible patients, uniting together around this demand to control the work hours and to get home attendants the rest and sleep time needed. It also grew to include Korean home attendants, Black and Latinx home attendants from the Dominican Republic, Honduras, Venezuela. And when we say it's AAPI women powering the community, it also lies in the way that AAPI workers themselves, without the kind of privilege to receive a PhD in theory in women's, studies, they are actually able to see that unity is important to fight back. That they see that their bosses claiming that Asian women workers actually like to work for long hours, 24 hours a day, actually are pitting them against Black and brown workers who are then portrayed as lazy, unwilling, that this whole racist rhetoric is pitting workers against each other in unfair competition. And just to wrap up, in 2019, the home attendants organized to introduce this bill to substitute 24-hour shifts with 12-hour split shifts in New York State. And it is also a way in which, power and policy actually does come from the people. And later on in the conversation, I'll also be happy to talk about the way in which that this mass campaign has grown to include workers of different trades and industries. And definitely I will talk about how I got involved as well as a, first, in the beginning, a student worker, and then an office worker. Thank you so much.
Reshma.
Thank you so much for those powerful words. I mean, as you were thinking, and I was kind of thinking about like what brings us all and what's our family's history that kind of brings us all to this conversation. And, my family came here as refugees from Uganda in 1973. We were one of the few Indian families that grew up in a white kind of working class neighborhood in the suburbs of Chicago. And, it was the 1980s, after, after the murder of Vincent Chin. And, you really felt, in the Midwest, kind of the racial tension against Asian Americans. And, I really felt that as a kid. My mother would get harassed for wearing a sari to the local Kmart. Our house was often, teepeed and egged. And I remember one night, some kids had spray painted on the side of our house, go back to your own country. And I remember when I woke up the next morning, my father was out there, with a box of Clorox and a rag. And he was just quietly cleaning the spray paint off the house. He didn't say anything. He didn't complain. He didn't complain about this country. And I remember watching him and thinking, I can't be like my dad. I can't be silent. Our parents grew up just being grateful that they were allowed in. And they felt like, their ticket to being American was to accept kind of hate crimes and violence without fighting back. And I think I grew up, very differently in acknowledging and seeing their pain and feeling like it was our generation's obligation to fight. And I think that growing up with that sense is what led me to start Girls Who Code, to fight for girls of color, to have economic opportunity and get those coding jobs so they can, march up into the middle class. It's what, currently has inspired me to fight, for mothers. I, like, many working moms, found myself at the beginning of this pandemic, barely holding on. I had a 3-week-old baby, a 5-year-old I was homeschooling, a global nonprofit that I was trying to save, because we know that the first organizations to get hit in economic recessions are ones that are supporting women and girls. I got COVID-19, but it barely registered because I was working 16 hours a day. My liver failed. I got acne on my face as if I was 16 years old. And when I looked at every mother on my Zoom screen, she looked exactly how I felt. And I think for so many of us, we had come to rely on the public school system as our childcare system. And so when the schools didn't open up in September, and we had less than 2 weeks notice to kind of figure out what to do, I think we just kind of lost it. And I think the sense that male legislators could make decisions that affect the very fabric of our lives without even thinking about us, without even calculating the loss to our mental health or to our paycheck, frightened me. And, when I looked up, again, to go back to my parents as refugees and, getting expelled from a country on a dime's notice without fighting back, I realized that there was no plan to help mothers. Mothers who, 3 million have been pushed out of the workforce. Our labor market participation was back where it was in 1989. For every 3 mothers that was leaving, 1 father was. And women of color were leaving at twice the rate as white women. 70% of low-income families are run by a woman of color. And oftentimes when she loses her job, the entire family goes into poverty, and nobody was talking about them. Nobody. And so, I wrote Marshall Plan for Moms just as an op-ed because I was pissed because I didn't see a plan. And so I talked to my PTA moms and I was like, what do you need? And, what I heard is we need money. We need money to pay the rent, to put food on the table. What else I heard was that we need paid leave and affordable childcare. What else I heard was, we need schools to open up safely 5 days a week. What else I heard was, we need federal training programs, because so many of the jobs that were lost were in retail, healthcare, education. Those were jobs that weren't coming back. And so, the Marshall Plan for Moms has become a national movement, to shorten the economic recovery for mothers and to put pressure on the public and private sector to center mothers, in the recovery. And if we're going to build back America back better, we have to build motherhood back better. Right now, 86% of unpaid, unseen work is done by moms, is done by women, in same-sex households. And, we know for single moms, it's even untenable. For mothers of color, it's even more untenable. And so we are, building this national conversation to create culture change, to change norms, and to change policy.
Thank you so much, Reshma. And now we'll hear from Kumuhina.
Aloha, everyone, and mahalo for this opportunity to share. At first, I wasn't as inclined to participate in the sharing because I was not sure if this forum was going to be the most sympathetic or the most effective in helping to bring about change. But I've heard some key things that some of you have shared. And one of them is about denialism, being in denial here in Hawaii. If you can imagine a few of the latest hot topics that tend to always migrate over from the continental US: Black Lives Matter, violence against Asians, especially Asian women. My community and my people doesn't necessarily have to take any kind of issue in, and yet we struggle to be seen and to be heard and to be acknowledged in our own home. And so on one hand, we should absolutely, by virtue of our culture, be quite not only sympathetic, but to be able to avail ourselves to these causes. However, for me personally, I I struggle with this because to be Hawaiian in my own homeland means to know that I will struggle because people in political and economic power will see us, know us, and even like us when it's convenient for them. And when it translates to economic dollars coming into Hawaii. Most recently, we have struggled with keeping our tourism authority accountable to our Native Hawaiian community. However, political and economic forces would ensure that this year legislation was put forward. So now our tourism authority is no longer going to be beholden to anything to our culture, meaning that the monies that come from tourism are not going to directly come from that industry in order to support the culture, the people, and the lives that they derive their living off of. Whenever something comes from America and it comes to Hawaii, it presumes that we Hawaiians are happy Americans, of which I happen to be someone here on this Zoom that I am not American. I am required to hold the United States passport, but the powers that be deny us our rightful history, and that is unacceptable. I was criticized as a leader of the Hawaiian community. I was criticized for asking the question about Black Lives Matters when I said to my community, let us not be quick to run down there. We need to know more information. Who is leading this? And some of my own people do not see beyond the veil of colonialism and cannot even see that my question was valid because the African American community needed to show who was going to take leadership and not let someone like me, who was looked at in the Hawaiian community for my own leadership, to get down there and then it gets sprung on me that I have to be a leader and I'm going to be approached to answer questions and to avail myself to it, of which I was not willing to be. You know, Hawaii has a bad habit of just importing everything, including LGBT. As a transgender woman in the community, my culture, I understand very clearly, has a space in place for me. But the conversation never does go any other way except LGBT. And we are not able to even reconcile our own existence according to the culture of these islands because majority of people don't know how to have this conversation. And so every aspect of LGBT, including same-sex marriage, and all of these other social issues that come with it, equity, representation, it becomes the most daunting task to advocate for my people because we are always blanketed by the veil of being American and all of the kind of, how do I say it? And I don't mean to be disrespectful to anyone here, but we are always struggling to say, hey, do you see us? Do you hear us? Because in our own homeland, the people in economic and political power don't. And so all of these issues that have come to Hawaii hurt. For as valid as they may be, people never look at us. And even when we speak up, I led the march of 20,000 people down the streets of Waikiki. And you think that any major new Hawaiian news coverage came? One station, and that's because I made friends with them. Did any American national news station come to cover us? No. When our people marched 20,000 strong, and it's because the United States of America refuses to look carefully at their history of American domination and illegal takeover of Hawaii. And to address that is addressing one too many bones in their closet. So there's so much to talk about, but I leave that for all of you to digest. And I appreciate all of you for doing the work that you do, but that is my nutshell of what little I can contribute to today.
Wow. Well, I want to thank all of the panelists for their powerful initial remarks and sharing their experiences. So I think what's really amazing about one of the themes that have come out in the conversation is the relationship of AAPI communities, because there are many, to each other, as well as AAPI communities' relationship and to other racial minority groups and the possibilities for coalition building. And Reshma, I was really moved by your immigration story because, you know, I came to this country from South Korea when I was 4 years old, and we actually, we landed in Queens, New York. And when we came over, my dad's a doctor, and he was, you know, he was trying to get a job, and his best friend actually lived in Hollis, Queens. So that's where we went because we didn't know where else to go. And we got to Hollis in 1979. And the landlord of my dad's best friend was actually this wonderful African-American family. Their names were Toy and Mary, and they just kind of showed us the ropes. They totally took us in. They drove my sister to school. Their daughter was a cheerleader at the local high school, so they took us to a football game. You know, they kind of taught us how to be American. And it was this really amazing thing that I think now, or as I grew up, you know, I became more aware of different kinds of tensions between communities. But when I landed in New York in 1979, my experience was one of complete kind of diversity and cooperation amongst groups. I mean, of course, then shortly after that, we also lived in Youngstown, Ohio, and our experiences were much more mixed. It was during a time when US Steel had laid off tons and tons of workers and left the town. And so there were a lot of racial tensions and resentments, and you know, it started coming into the era where there was resentment of Asian Americans because of the Japanese car industry kind of taking over at the time. So I guess it would be great to hear more about coalition building amongst AAPI communities and other groups and that experience. And Kumuhina, thank you so much for sharing your experiences about Hawaii. I mean, one of the most amazing things that came out of Hawaii in the early days of the pandemic was the first ever feminist economic recovery plan. And it was called Building Bridges, not Walking on Backs. And I guess that's also something that I wanted to highlight, both in terms of coalition building, as well as just economic recovery for working moms. Another theme that came out in Reshma's work, particularly the Marshall Plan for Moms, because even though we're talking about it now in the very specific context that none of us ever anticipated of COVID-19 taking over our lives and wreaking economic havoc on women in the past year, certainly the idea of centering women's experiences, and particularly their experiences of trying to combine work and feeding their families and caring for their families, was very much in the minds of some of the women who were fierce advocates for the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s. And one of the really moving parts of that story is not just that Patsy Mink was on the floor making these speeches about the needs of working women. Shirley Chisholm, who I mentioned, the first African-American Congresswoman, had actually run a daycare center in New York and was very attuned to these issues. And I think that if you look at their speeches in connection to each other and how they build off of each other in advocating for the ERA, it is something very powerful that resonates with many of the themes that have come up today, both in this conversation and in the larger national policy debate about what women, and especially women of color, need moving forward. And of course, I loved Yolanda's remarks also because centering the experience of low-wage women in particular, and home care workers, people who do care work, It's so important, and it's a global conversation, not just in the United States, but in the last few weeks of the pandemic. In Ireland, they've been having a debate about how they should protect not just mothers, but paid caregivers who do so much work that's essential to the health of the nation. And that's actually going into a conversation about what kinds of amendments they need in the Irish Constitution in the 21st century. And I think we can find inspiration from that as we try to connect the idea of constitutional change to the needs of both paid and unpaid caregiving in this country. And then just circling back to Miho, I loved your remarks and background about how the comfort women issue really draws out the importance of centering women's experiences throughout the world in international matters, human rights issues, as well as foreign policy issues. One of the most interesting experiences I had in the last few weeks is that I met on a panel a Swedish ambassador, Veronica von Danielsson, and she was talking about how the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Ministry put out the first ever feminist foreign policy. It's a 100-page document you can find on their website. But the idea that we need to be thinking about the experiences of women as we do trade policy, as we think about the past and how we make amends for our foreign policy past. These things are so important. And this is also something that the Equal Rights Amendment, because it requires every government actor to not abridge or deny equal rights on account of sex, expands this universe of centering women's experiences in every aspect of policymaking at every level of government. And I'm really glad that there's this one narrative among many having to do with comfort women and American militarization around the world that I think can draw more attention to that issue. So with that in mind, I would like to invite the panelists also to react to each other's remarks and to add on to everything that's been said so far.
I think the point that you made about coalition building is really powerful, because I think too, growing up in the 80s in Illinois, like brown and black people built a coalition together because they were the ones that were fighting against, or, you know what I mean, subject to kind of the white patriarchy. And so I think that that has always been, at least for me personally, such a core part of my identity, you know what I mean, as an activist and as an organizer. So, you know, even when I started Girls Who Code, you know, as an entrepreneur, you know, as a nonprofit leader, to me, thinking about how do you build an organization that is going to like, you know, get more Black and brown girls into tech was just kind of fundamental, you know, to the way that I organized. And I think, you know, the violence against Asian American women in particular, I think for a lot of us in the community, we have been experiencing, I mean, I the other night, or, you know, a month ago, I sat there on my bed and I started counting how many experiences of actual hate crimes I had, and I had to stop because it was so many. And I think so many of us have lived with this experience. And it was the sense of like this rite of passage. And I think the shock that other people were actually seeing that too for the first time, and that Asian people were speaking out for the first time about what they've experienced, was so powerful and moving. And I recognize that that power came from seeing my Black brothers and sisters having to be subject to it over and over and over again and fighting. And we learned to fight and speak from them. And so that, to me, again, that sense of coalition, that sense of community is so important, right? And it's so important for me, and I'll just speak as a South Asian woman, to see my proximity to whiteness and see my privilege, you know what I mean, in that. And then what my obligation is, you know, in terms of fighting racism and fighting for equality and acknowledging that. And, you know, Yolanda, you're shaking your head. And
Yeah, totally. I do want to add on to the coalition building. I do think that, you know, I personally learned so much from, like, yesterday we just had this demonstration in front of, you know, one of the like leading agencies who started this wage theft practice in the industry of home care, and they really paint this idea, you know, of you know, Asian workers are more industrious, you know, kind of model minority, that the myth, which actually separated us so much from the Black and brown folks, and you know how, you know, that workers are then pitted against each other, you know, thinking that like you know, like Julie also mentioned, you know, how with the Japanese auto industry coming, you know, like, or now with the Asian immigrant workers replacing the jobs, you know, how much we're divided, you know, but then how much also we share the same grievances, you know, even though like, you know, that feminist movement have done a lot to put more women in elected office and corporate offices, you know, we're still shut out from so much, and we're still, you know, we, you know, work crazy hours, you know, no matter what industries we are, you know, to get the bare minimum and to get by. And no matter where we're at, actually, you know, Hawaii or, you know, in a continent, how, you know, we're like, you know, we're constantly importing, like internalizing, you know, either just bad economic conditions and this acceptance that we have to work our way up, or just this, you know, bad ideologies that, you know, that we are powerless. And all of that is, to me, coming into my campaign, and seeing, you know, talking to the workers, talking to, you know, they're also older generation immigrants, you know, first generation immigrants, and they're in their, you know, 50s, 60s, talking to them, seeing how they came out, they speak out, you know, and that is really inspiring for me, that they're no longer begging for something, they're no longer willing to just, you know, beg for crumbs, you know, that no matter, you know, they want to see beyond even raising minimum wage, because, you know, no matter what the number is, like their time and life and health is still owned by their bosses. Like that ownership too is so like rarely talked about, you know, prior to me, you know, talking to them. And so I thought that I was really powerful, and I thought that really coming together and seeing how we in our own particularity are sharing this, you know, chains, you know, by American capitalism and imperialism, you know, is uniting us together. And I think that's what, you know, coalition building means for us to learn from the workers who are speaking out, and, you know, for all workers of all ethnic backgrounds to come together.
Miho. Oh, you're still muted, Miho. So cute how you had the raise hand function up, but
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I was born and raised in Japan, and I was schooled there, and they're really strict in the classroom, and they're always like, you have to raise your hand first. And I can't shake off that habit. It's so funny. Anyway, no, I really appreciate all the comments and all the shares. One thing, I mean, I don't even know where to start, but I guess my comment is that the importance of, I know this is totally like widely used term, but intersectionality, like, you know, so we get the ERA passed, you know, and there's that substantive like component to the right, you know, of women, right? That we are empowered, right? And we have a voice in policy making. And if we're not properly informed of the history of this country, right, and what it did to take over Hawaii, and the ongoing oppression of the people of Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and where all the bases are located, where local communities are in fierce opposition, and yet the US, you know, goes out of its way to preserve a super right-wing pro-military a regime in place, you know, to squelch the local communities' voices. If we're not really listening to those voices and the people on the ground that are impacted firsthand by the history of US, you know, imperial expansion, then we could easily inadvertently end up supporting practices and policies in those places that, further the U.S. imperial agenda. And this is a something that we have to think about in terms of, I think, all other issues. And we cannot compromise on certain levels. So what is that threshold? And I think to be really clear about how do we define the threshold of solidarity? So when we talk about women's rights, we're not talking about suffrage at the expense of Black men. We're not talking about suffrage so that we could, support further regime change abroad. Or, like the women of Afghanistan, right now are in an intractable situation. When we become more and more influential constituents of this country, because of the place that it holds in world politics, there's an enormous responsibility that comes with it. And I think there's this thing of interiorized colonies or something like that. But the whole idea is that within the belly of the beast, that there's a third world community, and that, just like militarism and war depend on patriarchy, right, and misogyny, we understand that, imperialism depends on racialization, right? And then women, like the comfort women, were mostly from the poorest of the poor communities throughout the colonies, okay? The women in Atlanta, had they had, a degree from like the Seoul's most elite university, right? Or had the connections in the Korean community in Atlanta, then, the choices would have been entirely different. I think class is a really important thing to think about, because we need to connect migration. Our communities here, API communities on the mainland, just talking firsthand experience, I'm on the mainland, have this like intricate, connection ongoing with our motherland, whether we're citizens or not, right? We have relatives there, our lineage is there, whatever the cause. And whatever happens in geopolitics that affects the motherland directly affects us, right? And also, you talked about American capitalism. There's a push factor from our own homelands. The comfort women, many of them could not even return home, because a lot of these communities have these values. These women are tainted, right? And so you're going to bring the whole family down. You're not going to do that. And they never actually were able to go home. And there's so many women who are trafficked and who end up in sex parlors in the United States for sex, exploitation and other things too, that are completely suffering. And I have to say, the comfort woman things happened 7 decades ago. Right now, what's going on might not be state sanctioned per se, but we have not done a very good job advancing. And as long as we continue to create workers that are under marginalized and, made profoundly invisible, leveraging the already invisible history, wiped out by the delusional, history that, like Hawaii just one day, became the state, in the United States. That I think, that there's going to be connections that, we'll overlook if we don't keep our eyes open. So that's kind of what I'm feeling. I'm kind of all over the place, but I'm very profoundly moved by what everyone said. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I wondered, Kumuhina, if you wanted to react also, because I saw that you put some really interesting comments in the chat also about the category of AAPI in relation to Native Hawaiian experiences. And I think that's a really interesting point in relation to the problems and possibilities of coalition building. And I wondered if you had any reactions to everything that has been said or comments on that.
Yes, thank you. This is it is indeed far more complex, but it is illustrated in a very simple example. The word mainland. my generation and many others, along with myself, including these next generations that are coming up now. My parents' generation, even my grandmother's generation, the word mainland has been used to identify the United States of America. Therefore, it has removed my people from looking to Hawaii, our home, when we live here in our home, as that which we center ourselves around. Here's the problem. Whenever we aspire to that which has been fed to us in every which way possible, so much so that we are not able to avoid it. When the American dream becomes our own, and living in our islands and the way of life of our people is no longer the acceptable norm and is no longer the desired place to be, my people continue to leave Hawaii. And those of us who are left here at home, we must struggle to convince everybody and do everything short of begging everybody else in power, and that's political and economic, to see us, to hear us. And it is as simple as understanding what's in a word when we say our mainland. For those of you whose homeland or whose motherland comes from China, Japan, Korea, India, wherever you may come from, however it is that your family and your generations may have arrived to what is now known to the world as the United States of America, to live in our own home and to not have the dignity of having even a voice in our own home is absolutely unacceptable. The um, the question that was posed to me: is there a movement for more Native Hawaiians to run for office? This is a yes and a no, because our political system is so intimately tied to U.S. politics. Is there a movement? There's been every effort. I myself, as much as I despise the discussion, I have to run for political office, or I have to assert myself within the current political context. Otherwise, there would be even more effort to sweep us, not only under the rug, but to deny our existence altogether. And then the everybody else's sort of do what they're already doing. And that is to superimpose their own understandings of my culture and my language and to appropriate it as they feel necessary. So, yes, there is effort, but at the end of the day, this, for example, American bipartisan politics so dominated Hawaii that, and there's no getting around it. But our own people fail to see that it is one of the major things that even further divides us today. And this was reinforced with police violence, Black Lives Matter, violence against Asian women. It just all gets imported in, and yet our people fail to see where we were just 20 years ago, 40 years ago. The Hawaii that I grew up in and the Hawaii that I know is not the Hawaii of today. And that is because this continued tide bringing everything that just pretty much telling us this is your life now. And unfortunately, there's a lot of my own people that aren't being critical thinkers about what they're digesting and what they're allowing to transform how they see the world and how they engage it. There are many of us who understand this, but we are always taken into the larger context of our existence. So it's a struggle. I could go on, but I know that this Zoom is not centered around Hawaii and it's not centered around my comments. But yeah, there's so much more to say, but thank you.
So we just have a few minutes left, and the audience wants to know how they can support the AAPI community. So could I just ask each of the panelists to give a few words on that? We could start with Rashma.
You know, I think it's learning more, you know, asking questions. I think it's seeing us and hearing our stories.
Yolanda.
Yeah, I think it's being there for each other and knowing that it is the same system, even through very particularistic struggles. We're all here together.
Miho.
How to support AAPI. You know, AAPI community is not monolithic. I think there's so many communities that are completely invisible, even in statistics, because they're so tiny. Like in my backyard is Pacific Islander community, like Tongans and Southeast Asians, and their families are being torn apart because of the Trump era policies. So it's this whole pipeline between criminal justice and deportation. And I think, you know, a lot of the women are in the forefront of these struggles, but they don't really come up when we group all of us together as AAPIs. And so for targeted solidarity, I think, you know, looking around and really applying not just you know, the one kind of a framework, but, you know, really need to be intersectional within the Asian community. There's so many communities that are left behind and struggling. And I think, you know, while diverse approaches are necessary and resources are limited, there are ways that we could be intentional in solidarity.
And Kumuhina.
What more can I say? I just placed a comment into the chat, you know, given the comments just stated.
It's 1 o'clock.
I think I would just simply like everyone to know that this discussion is absolutely relevant and absolutely a very formidable bond and relationship to continue on. However, it's all relative to where your center is. And so here in Hawaii, many of us who have been behind the political independence movement for Hawaii, which is actually a very scary discussion because there are implications to it that I truly understand would create a whole different range of issues. But many of us who have been behind political independence from the United States of America will know that everything from how we are referred to, from having to, as someone who worked in HIV prevention education, we were always listed in our own homeland as Asian Pacific Islander. No. That's not that's not where we want to come from in Hawaii. We're not Asian Pacific Islander.
Right.
We are Kanaka in our own homeland. You will address us as such. But
That's right.
whether it's the LGBT community and HIV AIDS prevention education, whether it's education, we are always forced to get sucked right back in to this larger diaspora of how we have to engage. And even to acknowledge as trans, you know, like, can you imagine? I come from a culture that already has he, she, and it all in one pronoun. But yet, whenever it comes to support for this culture, we are always the ones first on the chopping block to get rid of programs that support us. So now, even more normalcy to what's your pronoun? He, she, they, you know, and you really can't argue it. You just sort of do this because nobody gets it. Other people here don't get it. So it frustrates me, but I can only leave you all with my aloha and my appreciation for wanting my thoughts.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to get all these diverse perspectives this evening. And I just want to say that the Equal Rights Amendment is a constitutional change that requires broad coalitions and broad consensus in order to get passed. And that's been building for over 100 years with the contributions of many communities. And I think that equality for women is something that cuts across all of these differences. And I hope that it's something that we'll continue to work on together.
Oh my goodness, Julie and crew, thank you so much. What a mesmerizing conversation. I was totally riveted by what all of you were saying. I find it profoundly,
Well, I put a film on there.
profoundly moving. So I want to thank Julie Suk, Miho Kim, Yolanda Zhang, Reshma Suzani, and Kumuhina for a great conversation. It will be up on our Facebook page and on our website for forever to come, because I want everybody to hear this conversation. We want to make sure that you know that this Saturday, May 1st, starts Asian American Pacific Islander Month. So a lot to celebrate, a lot to learn, a lot to consider. We hope you will follow us on our website, eracoalition.org, participate in our actions, and shop for your mom. Don't forget Mother's Day. We have 28th Amendment necklaces. They are fabulous. And we can also do a video for the mom in your life. Put her in a video along with some perhaps more famous moms for a great gift. So go to eracoalition.org. Thank you all so much for being with us today, panelists and audience. We appreciate you so much, and we'll see you at the next time, the next event. Have a great week.